I'm not throwing all my butter out, don't get me wrong, but I am now using a lot more ghee. And you're gonna wanna hear why, because the research is pretty wild from a metabolic perspective. And it makes a lot of sense, because when we understand what ghee is and what is absent in ghee, then it starts making more sense. Also, just some of the components and what happens to ghee when you make ghee, well, it really helps us understand, hey, this is a pretty amazing fat. So let's go ahead and break it down. And after today's video, if you're focused on metabolic and mitochondrial health, check out Timeline. So you've heard of autophagy before. This is called mitophagy. So Timeline is a unique compound called urolithin A. Urolithin A encourages mitochondrial health by inducing what's called mitophagy. So it basically helps the mitochondria recycle broken down, unused components of itself to make your mitochondria stronger. The mitochondria is where you produce energy. So that's why Timeline is known as a company called Timeline Longevity, and their patent is MitoPure. So a lot of people feel a pretty immediate effect with Timeline when using urolithin A. Personally, it took about a week or two for me to notice more energy, a little bit better sleep, more recovery in the gym. But there's also a longevity component too, because mitochondria is obviously not just the powerhouse of the cell, it's also a key component for good, healthy longevity. So that link down below gets you 10% off Timeline's urolithin A. So really cool compound. Again, top line in the description underneath this video. All right, one of the things we have to look at is really, really important. Visceral fat accumulation. Trans fats are absolutely associated with visceral fat. We've seen this in the literature. We've seen trans fats associated with inflammation, with obesity, with visceral fat, with fatty liver. So check out this study that was published in Nutrients. It was a systematic review looking at 33 different studies, and they did look at various oils and various fats. What they found is that when fats were heated up to about 200 degrees Celsius or about 390 degrees Fahrenheit, most of them didn't really have much of a change in fatty acid or trans fatty acid content. But when they were heated between 390 and about 464 degrees Fahrenheit, there was a huge increase in the trans fats of these fats. So even healthy fats, once they are cooked to a certain temperature, and especially if it's sustained, it actually changes their structure to become trans fats. So we look at trans fats, we're like, yeah, I'm not gonna eat that stuff. I'm not gonna eat partially hydrogenated oil. Partially hydrogenated oil has literally been banned, so it's harder to get. Here's the thing, butter, you do not wanna cook with at a high temperature. It caps out around 350 before it starts to convert into more trans fats. Whereas ghee can get closer to 480 to 500 degrees before it starts to produce trans fats. So when it comes to cooking, you want the more stable ghee, but that's not the only thing that it is, okay? When you cook the milk solids out of butter, you are left with a high concentration of vitamin A and vitamin D. That's a really powerful thing. The more antioxidant profile you have in the fat, the more protection you have against the oxidation of that fat. So not only is it a more stable saturated fat, when it's in your body, it has more of a protective mechanism to protect it from what's called lipid peroxidation, where the fats actually go rancid and cause, well, rancidity and potentially in the cell membrane and other issues like that, right? You're having a bad problem. You're having a problem where you're gonna trigger an inflammatory response. But the other thing is that simply cooking out the milk solids, you're cooking out the lactose, which is great, but you're cooking out the caseins. We are seeing more and more evidence now that the A1 type milk that is out there, the A1 type dairy, which is most of the dairy in the US, is actually potentially problematic. Okay, potentially problematic because of this BCM7. That's why you're seeing more brands pushing towards what's called the A2 variety. You're seeing that A2 breed of cattle becoming more, I don't want to say popular, but in demand for sure. I just did some videos on this talking about how that works. BCM7 is linked with inflammatory responses. There's even evidence that suggests that the BCM7 or the casein, the beta caseins in milk are actually what trigger more of the digestive issues than the lactose itself. So lactose intolerance may not be as real of a thing, when in reality, it's just the casein proteins that are the problem and that only exists in the A1 variety. Rambling, the point is that if you're having ghee, that's cooked out and it's a moot point. So you're left with a concentrated milk fat, which is really, really stable and high in antioxidants. But let's talk about some more interesting evidence. There was a study that was published in Nutrients that took a look at different lengths of saturated fats. So you have long chain saturated fats, then you have shorter chain saturated fats. They're still saturated fats, but they're just different, right? Not all saturated fat is created equal. They're wildly different. So the longer the chain typically, we see a little bit more potential risk, at least from a correlation perspective, of coronary vascular disease. So even though that's correlation, we can still say, okay, ghee is going to be much more in the way of shorter saturated fat chains, okay? So they're easier to break down, less likelihood of causing potential problems. Now, all of this is a moot point, realistically, if you're probably in a caloric deficit. Okay, saturated fats become much more problematic when you're overeating, yada, yada. Okay, let's look at the glucose side of things though, because this is really interesting. There's a study that was published in the International Journal of Pharmaceutical Research, and I'm going to read you exactly what the author said. The author said, and I quote, "Cow ghee possesses a good anti-diabetic property." They gave subjects 7 days of ghee, okay? And what they found is by the 7th day, their glucose levels were lower. Now, there's a potential mechanism here. Okay, now this is speculative, but we do know that ghee contains a higher amount of what's called linolenic acid. It's an omega-3. This linolenic acid can actually bind to a receptor on a pancreatic beta cell. It closes what is called a KATP channel. When this channel closes, it causes what is called a membrane depolarization. This depolarization changes the structure in a way so that insulin can actually be released. So that's the potential mechanism here why ghee could have anti-diabetic properties. Now, this is rodent model stuff, so we can't 100% take it to the bank. But again, we see some interesting research and some interesting correlations that make us think, ghee could be promising. Now, there was another interesting study from a diabetes perspective that was published in the journal Diabetes that was looking at butyrate. Now, ghee is exceptionally high in butyrate. It's a short chain fatty acid. Butyrate is actually produced in our gut by bacteria when they digest fiber. Okay, it produces butyrate, but ghee has butyrate in it already. So what this study in diabetes was looking at, it noticed that butyrate itself actually influenced mitochondrial biogenesis. It increased the expression of what's called PGC1A. So it made the mitochondria actually proliferate and created more mitochondrial density. More mitochondrial density means more energy output, more energy creation. It also means more places to metabolize fat and sugar and carbs in general. Stronger muscles, more stamina, more respiration, more fat oxidation. They noticed in this study that it also triggered an increase in AMPK. AMPK is sort of the energy sensor within the body. So when AMPK is activated, it means that your body starts pulling from stored tissue more. It senses that you're in a deficit. Okay, it's the opposite of mTOR. So mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin, that's when you're building, growing. AMPK is when you are breaking down fat and you're sort of using your onboard fuel. Now, really interesting, this is the wild one. There was a study published in the Indian Medical Journal. Took a look at 1,982 people and they divided them into groups. Those that ate a high amount of ghee, over 1 kilogram per month, or those that ate less than 1 kilogram per month. Those that ate 1 kilogram or more per month actually consumed more calories, they consumed more saturated fat, and they consumed more monounsaturated fat. But somehow they ended up with less coronary heart disease. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds of this. The point is that we know from some other research that some of the compounds that are in ghee could be strongly anti-inflammatory. So if you have a higher amount of anti-inflammatory compounds, a potentially lower inflammatory response within the body, that could outweigh some of the issues with saturated fat. Now, I'm not a physician, I'm not going to speak to that. But when you look at the literature, it's quite interesting. I mean, you have people that are literally eating more calories, more saturated fat in general, more ghee, and somehow they're ending up better when it comes down to cardiometabolic health. So we see this with the study on glucose control. We see this with this particular study. It's pretty interesting. So at the end of the day, I'm not throwing out my butter. I'm not going to get rid of the butter, but I definitely am not going to cook with it. And I'm definitely going to lean towards more stable fats. Again, things like the tallow, things like the ghee, but I'm going to lean a little bit more towards ghee because the antioxidant profile is stronger. As always, keep it locked to here my channel. See you tomorrow.